Okay, we have plenty of time. We're starting earlier. Is this better? Okay, I'll see what I can do. Okay, before we start, I need to know something about you. So could you tell me, please, could you raise your hand if you design examinations? Who designs examinations? Maybe 80% of you. When you design your examinations, do you think about the impact of your examinations on teaching and learning? Could you tell me if you think about the impact? About 40% of you. Okay, if you think about the impact, do you think about the impact now, or do you think about the impact in the future, the long-term future? Both. Okay, then I hope that this presentation will be relevant to you and that it will be of use to the other people who perhaps are not designing examinations at the moment, but may have something to do with examining systems. Now, the name of my talk is The Best Laid Plans of Mice and Men. Do any of you know this expression? One person. Okay. Well, for the others, this comes from a poem, a very, very meaningful poem by a Scottish poet called Robert Burns. And the name of the poem is To a Mouse. So the poem is for a mouse. Robert Burns was working in the countryside a long time ago. He was working in the field. He was plowing in the field. And when he was plowing in the field, he dug up, accidentally, the nest of a mouse. He felt very, very bad because he knew that the mouse had been working all summer to create this nest for the winter. But Robert Burns destroyed the nest like that. So he wrote a poem to the mouse to say, I'm sorry. But he also said to the mouse, you are not alone. The same thing happens to us, human beings. We work a long time to create something, and then sometimes our plans go wrong. So, in Scottish English, he said, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang oft agly. This means the best laid plans of mice and men often go wrong. Now, this sounds very pessimistic, and I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think it's important to be realistic and think about the plans that we make. And are we considering all the factors we need to consider to make it possible for the plans to succeed? So this is the name of the presentation again. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. And the story is about what happened in some other countries when people tried to create the perfect examination system. As I'm telling you the story, I would like for you to think about your situation. And are there any similarities with what I'm going to tell you? Now, the story takes place about 20 years ago, in the 1990s. Picture the 1990s. I think all of you are old enough to remember the early 1990s. The Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet Union collapsed. There were many countries which were in change. They were having to change. Now, it was very exciting times, very exciting, especially for young people, but very difficult times as well. In these countries, and there were many countries like this, independence meant searching for a new identity and new systems. So they were looking for new political systems, new economic systems, new educational systems. And in the educational systems, they were thinking about teaching, of course, but also about evaluation and certification. So people were having to create things from new to impose their own identity after many years of being suppressed by other countries. Now, I said there were many countries in this situation, and there were conferences like this, international conferences, and testing and evaluation was always at the top of the agenda. So I have some examples here. In 1995, in the Organization of Economic and, what is OECD? Something development. But many people met and they placed examination reform at the top of their policy agenda. LTEX, this is an English language organization, international, talked about testing reform, the most urgent of the ELT developments for the region. The region means Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union. Now, I know these countries are very far from Spain, but there might be some similarities. I hope you will tell me later. Okay. Now, people wanted to reform the system. What was wrong with the old system? Now, there were problems with the quality of examinations, and there were problems with the relationship between the examinations and the greater context. The quality of examinations, I'm talking here principally about school examinations. Many of these countries wanted to create new examinations for the end of secondary school, between secondary school and university. So what were the problems? Knowledge-based curriculum. So people were learning grammar. Oh, by the way, quality of exam. This is not just English language exams. It's all languages. So people were learning grammar, testing vocabulary, but not testing skills. It was knowledge-based rather than skills-based. Teachers designed the examinations for their own schools. There was no state control. Lack of uniformity in administration. Assessment methods were very conservative, very outdated. Teachers marked their own students. So you didn't have a neutral, objective way of doing things. It was the teachers in the schools who were examining their own students. No agreed criteria for marking. This differed from school to school. Lack of reliability. So if you gave the same test 2 times, you might not get the same result. And you couldn't compare one school with another school. There was no standard. This was long before the Council of Europe and other scales like that. Now, in the greater context, and I know some of you work in administration, so this might be interesting to you, the state couldn't guarantee the quality of the examination certificates. The universities looked at the school leaving certificates and they didn't believe the results, so they had to create their own examinations. So then the students had to worry about school leaving examination and the university examination. Lots of stress. The state couldn't evaluate whether things were going well because they didn't know. Things were different in every school. There was some bias in the system if people were marking their own pupils, some corruption in the system, and nobody was coordinating the effort. Now, in the mid-90s, in some countries, they decided they really must take testing and evaluation seriously and do a big reform. So the story I'm going to tell you about is 3 countries in the former Soviet Union. And the teams, what the teams who created, Christina was talking about teams earlier, what the teams who created the examinations experienced. Now, imagine you are the Minister of Education or civil servants in the Ministry of Education, and you want to create a team to lead a reform movement in testing and evaluation. Okay, who would you put on the team? Teachers. Why? Okay, teachers because they know what to do. Okay, now I could keep on saying, what do you mean, but let's leave it. Teachers, they know what to do. Does everybody agree some teachers should be on the team? Who else? Some experts, some teachers or some people who have been trained in testing, so you might want some people who know something about the technicalities of testing. Who else would you put on the team? The function of the examination is to certify achievement in secondary school and notify the universities how good the students are in language. Who else might go on the team? Educational authorities, for example. Okay, my friend is saying representatives from the ministry or more local authorities. Why? Okay, if they don't give you their support, you can't accomplish anything. All right, good. So you're thinking, yes. University teachers, why? Okay, so people from university who can give some input and inform the process. Right, okay, so you've got the idea. What we need is a very varied team of people. And that's what happened in each of the 3 countries. The teams were very small, 5 or 6 people. Think about your own teams and see if this is similar. Now, what you had was you always had somebody from the ministry. And the idea was that that person could fight for you. They could lobby for you. They could inform you of developments. That was the idea. You had people from the university who could inform you about their needs, but also the university people gave credibility to the effort. People, if they say, there are university people there, they think, it's a serious effort. So it was a face validity exercise, as well as a true intellectual contribution. And you had teachers. And the reason you had teachers was to keep the thing on the ground, not up in the sky. That was the idea, anyway. Now, one of our colleagues said, you need some experts on testing. But the problem was, at that time, there were no experts on testing. So you had 5 or 6 people from each country, and they had to be trained. So the training course, they did some training in the UK. And the training had to do with the technicalities of language testing, but also project planning and management. Because you can be very, very clever in testing and very, very naive about politics, and I'm sure you know this. Okay, I've been talking to some of you last night and today, and you know this very well. So people had training in both of these things. In their training program, they had to design implementation plans, and there were further training courses. So it wasn't just one training. This went on for several years in the UK and in the home countries. I'm not giving you the names of the countries, by the way, because it would betray confidentiality. Okay. All right. Now, in the initial teacher training course, there were several outcomes, several products. One was called a baseline study. Baseline study is when you look at the situation before the reform and you see, what is the situation? What are people teaching? What are the materials? What is the mentality? What are the attitudes? What is realistic in terms of change? Examination specifications, of course. So what is your new exam going to look like in terms of the length and the skills and the item types, etc. Project management frameworks. So the teams had to think about what they needed to do over the next few years. What activities did they need to do? How would they know if they were successful? How long would it take? How much would it cost? So a lot of business type things as well. Job descriptions was very important. Now, each member of the team had a specialty. So there was a reading person, a writing person, a listening person, etc. But they also had other responsibilities, not only academic. So there was a general leader. Who was the boss? Who was the academic boss? Who would take care of finances? Who would take care of archiving, keeping records? Who would take care of discipline to make sure everybody else did what they were supposed to do? Does this sound familiar to you? I mean, these teams, I don't know about your situation, but these teams, at the beginning of the reform, they had to do everything. So they had to do the academic as well as the social, political, economic, etc. Communication webs. This is a communication web. So if you're going to introduce new examination, you have to make sure that everybody who matters knows what you're doing and that they have a chance to contribute to what you're doing. So schools, students, teachers, parents, we have to keep them informed, but also the in-service people, the employers, the funding bodies, and any number of parties. So you need to keep them informed and you need to get their input. So who takes care of that? Who communicates with whom? So the university people communicated with the university. The school teachers communicated with the schools. The ministry person did the politicking bit of it, but they had to figure all of this out. Finally, the last output of the initial training was something called projections. This was 1993 or 94, and each team had to produce a document saying, in 3 or 4 years' time, what will we see? What do we project? What do we want at that time? Now, we called this the projections document. If you look at your handouts, you have one which says analysis of intentions as presented in the projections document. Does everybody have this? Now, this is the list of the types of things that these new teams wanted to see in 3 or 4 years' time. Again, I ask you to think about your own projects, your own situations, and whether any of these things look familiar. So the first thing, create testing infrastructure. A system, a center. There was nothing in those days. Perhaps your situation is better than that. Although it's silly to say perhaps it's better, because sometimes if you have a system or you have a structure in place, it's the wrong structure, and you have to fight against it. So they create new structures. They needed to design the examinations, of course, and there's a whole list of things, and your workshops and papers this afternoon are going to cover many of these areas. They were thinking about washback, the influence of the examination on the classroom, whether it makes for better teaching and learning or worse teaching and learning. So there are some things here. Teachers and students understand the examination. They're using language for communication. Cross-cultural awareness was one of the goals of the teams. How to promote washback. It's one thing to say we want washback. It's another thing to say, how do we get it? How do we ensure it happens? Research into washback, promoting transparency, accountability, and ownership. So that, again, they were thinking about how to inform people of what's happening, how to record what's happening, and so on. Now, if you look at the next page, this is the wider impact. One type of impact is washback, what happens in the classroom. Another type of impact is what happens in the educational system as a result of your exams, or what happens in greater society. Here it says, the society trusts the validity and the reliability of the exams. Universities will use the examinations, so there's only one examination, not two different ones. Continuity, cooperation, centralized. All of the teams wanted central marking. They didn't want teachers to be the only judges. Improved assessment in schools, better educational experience for students, prestige of the teaching profession will rise, and the education system will become more effective. So very ambitious goals for 3 or 4 years, but that's good. Ambition is good. Okay, here are some specific statements. They believed that the new test would bring about the communicative approach. That's the approach they wanted in the classroom. The new test in English, the teams were all English language teams. The countries had to start somewhere. So they generally started with English, well, they always started with English language, because it was the most taught language, the most desired language, and the best funded language. There was money to do that. But the teams thought, well, with our English language examination, we can influence other languages. Okay, centralized testing. So they believed that their procedures might affect the assessment of other languages. And the system of education will become more effective We've just seen that. So if we change this exam, it will have impact, 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 and eventually the whole system will be better. In 1997, so about 4 years after the teams began, there was a big conference, and everybody thought, well, we've been successful, and we've got exams, we've got systems, all sorts of systems, delivering the examination, registering the people, marking, quality control, everything's in place, we're training people, it's great, and they all lived happily ever after. No. Okay, 10 years later, I was involved in the training, and I loved those teams. I loved them, and I always wondered what's happened. So 10 years later, I got a little bit of funding, and I went back to the countries to see what had happened in those 10 years. What had happened to the exams, what had happened to the teams, did they achieve the impact that they wanted, and did they have any advice for other teams? What do you think happened? Did they? No? What does that mean? Everything diluted, says our colleague. Okay. Any other guesses? Okay. This is like a mystery story, isn't it? Okay. Right. This was very common in all the countries, that up until about 2001, they achieved their goals, they had a good exam, they had materials to help teachers, training of exam personnel, good impact on the classroom. Before these new exams, there was no teaching of listening, and there was no teaching of writing, and these things were happening, so that was good. And the exam had been accepted by the universities. All right. Now, so the first few years, great. Then, what happened? Okay, the original team wanted to retire. They had been working so hard, so they wanted to retire. It's not only because they'd been working hard, but they'd been suffering a lot from things that were happening around them. The quality of the exam was in decline. There was no more pre-testing. The difficulty of the exam varied from year to year. Speaking exams were not recorded, so there was no evidence of what happened in the exams. No statistical analysis, and little teacher training. Okay. So first 5-6 years, everything went well, and then it went downhill. Okay, why might that have been? What were the factors that caused something to be successful for a little while, but in the long term, there were problems? Any ideas? Lack of continuity. Okay, sorry? Poor planning. Okay, they'd done a lot of planning, but yeah, maybe there was some problems with the planning. Investment. Okay. Investments from politicians and other stakeholders. And you said? Lack of support from the administration. It sounds like some of you have been through this experience. Okay. Yeah, it's a familiar story. So at the beginning I said, even though the story is about 3 countries in the former Soviet Union. Maybe you recognize some of the characteristics. So what have we got? Right. Factors at play. So let's look at the top level. The ministry, the policy, the exam center. Uncertainty about the future of the exam. The exam became a very political toy. And so as different parties were fighting, it was never clear, will we have the exam next year? Will we have the exam in 2 years' time? Remember, there was a person from the ministry who was supposed to be negotiating, informing, doing deals. In all 3 countries, that person just wasn't high enough. They were strong, they were good, but they weren't exactly in the right position. The authorities lacked expertise. I've heard this story so many times. They don't understand why you need to pre-test, why you need to, examine the results of your analysis. The personnel kept changing. So in the ministry, especially with new governments, completely new people, so our colleague said lack of continuity. Resourcing problems, like our colleague over there said. No research on the exam, so people couldn't learn the lessons from the future, and no sense of history. Because people were constantly changing, some of the people that I interviewed didn't know about the early days, didn't know about the projections document, didn't understand the rationale of the whole thing. The exam had just become accepted, and it changed, but nobody really appreciated what had gone into it or what it needed. Now, this is interesting. It's not only factors within the system, but factors elsewhere. So the teachers were changing. A lot of the teachers were getting old and retiring, so new teachers came in. Teacher training options, the funding wasn't there. Regional training centers, gone. Logistical problems, and not much synergy between the key players. Now, the key players are people like the curriculum designers, and the testers, and the teacher trainers, and the in-service teacher trainers, and the publishers, and the textbook writers. So not much communication, not much synergy. This was interesting. Those teams did what they could to keep everybody informed. Remember the communications web. But they felt that the exam had become high stakes, that means important, too early. So when the governments, when the ministries knew that there was an exam being created, they decided very quickly this would be the official examination. So there was no time, usually, to pre-test as much as you wanted to pilot, etc. Happening too fast. The teams realized that perhaps their vision was too advanced. So they pictured writing tests. But I told you before that there had been no writing tests. So how do you introduce the notion of writing? How do you introduce the notion of listening to authentic materials? How do you introduce the notion of speaking and giving opinions if people have lived under a repressive regime where you didn't give your opinions very easily? So the team realized that even though they thought they were being cautious, perhaps they were just a bit too advanced and weren't carrying everybody with them. Teachers were afraid of change. Things like recording speaking exams. felt very threatening. Institutional rivalries. Okay, suppose you are on the team and you are from another institution and you want to be on the team and you spend a lot of time defending your position or attacking. So that took some energy, and opponents with different ideologies, etc. Now, I've told you a sad story, but it's an interesting story because those teams were solid teams. They worked hard, they stuck together, they stuck to their principles. The system, though, depended on them to do everything. So over the years, they got tired, they felt used, and they were gradually worn down, and they retired finally, or they stopped working in 2001. And then the new teams were taking over, and lots of the problems became more apparent. How interesting, though, in all three countries, by 2006, the teams had come back together, and they were trying to repair the situation. That was their case. That doesn't always happen, but I thought it was interesting it happened there. Now, the factors, I've gone over some of the factors affecting long-term success, but I wonder if we could take a look at handout 2 and look at a few more in detail. We've got a little bit of time. We've got quite a bit of time because we started early, but I'll finish at 1:15. Okay, so if you look at the handout that says factors affecting long-term examination impact. Now, rather than me reading this to you, could you take a couple of minutes and could you just look at the handout and see whether there's anything that seems familiar to you, seems threatening to you, seems like something you should be thinking about in your situation. So this is your free time, and feel free to chat with each other. I'll give you a couple of minutes, and then we'll talk about the handout. Okay. Could I ask, please, are there some... I'm going to assume that many of these things are relevant. That's probably not a safe assumption. It may be that some of these things are not relevant to your own situation, but some of them may be. And I'm wondering if one or two of you might mention some factors that you found interesting for whatever reason. Any volunteers? I hope I'm not pressuring you too much. Yes? No? Okay.
Can I say it in Spanish? A mí me parece que cuando yo leo esto, si yo pienso en cómo empezamos, algunas de las casillas las marcaría con un excelente o casi excelente. Pero al cabo de los 4 o 5 años no lo marcaría como excelente, porque empezar es como más fácil. Conseguir fondos para formarte nunca es fácil, al menos yo en mi contexto no lo ha sido nunca, pero se puede. Pero al cabo de los 5 años, mantener el archivo, mantener el respeto de que esta mesa y este armario son nuestros, el acceso, cosas tan tontas como el acceso a la fotocopiadora, la confidencialidad, se va diluyendo porque una de las cuestiones que yo creo que son más difíciles de conseguir es convencer a todo el mundo que los exámenes cada año es un proceso largo y arduo y duro. Y no solo el primer año y el segundo año, es cada año producirlo. Y una vez los has producido 4 o 5 años, se da por sentado que se hará solo y a ti te pueden encargar otras cosas. Yo no sé si a los demás les pasa esto, que es lo que ha pasado, al menos en nuestro contexto en Cataluña, y hemos aguantado 20 y pico años porque somos un poco voluntariosas, pero... I don't know how... It's a bit frustrating. And the situation in Spain for many of us is precisely this. So I found it very interesting, and maybe in the cells, sort of at the beginning and after 5 years might also help visualize things.
Yes, I don't know what you call this phenomenon. It's something like, I don't know, well, Neo's mentioned that people come and go, and some things that you established, some understandings that you establish at the beginning cannot be sustained because the people aren't there. And I don't know how you solve this problem in your own situation. But I think the important thing is to be aware that continuity of all sorts, one of our colleagues over here mentioned continuity, is so important. So even though the people may be changing, is the message remaining? But I must admit, it's difficult. And it's very difficult if you are depending on outside funding. Because the funders, in the case of these 3 teams, a lot of the funding came from the British Council. So it was foreign funding to get started. But the Council had other priorities. To be frank, Eastern Europe was a priority in the mid-90s, but come 2000, then you've got to think about other ways of spending your money. So they can't stay there forever. So how do you develop the ability to sustain something once that money, it wasn't a lot of money, but it was a bit of money, once that money is gone, or again, once the governments change. One thing I think is very important, and again, I don't know how this works in your environments, is the examination center. The position of the examination center as an independent body where you don't have to negotiate with the minister. You don't have to ask for funding from the minister or for the government. The governments come and they go. But the center remains independent, politically independent, with its own equipment, its own space, its own personnel, its own policy. But it may not be possible here. I don't know. I honestly don't know. Are all of your examination centers, all of your public examination centers dependent on the ministry? Yeah. Yeah. So then the question comes, is there any way around that? And I don't know. I'm lucky because I can go home tomorrow. I don't mean to be facetious, but it's for every team to work out. And if things aren't going to change, then what strategies do you have for getting around that? Neus mentioned the fact that in her context, that they've been able to work for, did you say 20 years? Yeah, and I think last night you were telling me that your ideas were not super advanced or super radical, maybe quite even conservative. But if that's what it takes to convince all the stakeholders that they should respect what you're doing, okay, so each group needs to think about its own strategy. Is there anybody else who would like to say something about any of these factors?
Public relations. I think public relations are very, very important. When you try to convince people that what you're doing is right and what you're doing is useful, which is sometimes very, very, very difficult.
Yes, on page 3, the middle of the page, it says public relations. So disseminating your information to all the stakeholders with something like the communications web, consulting with them, creating a critical mass of supporters. This term, I don't know if this term translates into Spanish, but critical mass does not mean that the people are critical of you. It means you have enough people on your side that the reform can continue. If you only have 2 or 3 people or 100 people, it's too few people. You need a mass of people, and this is called the critical mass, to support you. So how do you create that following? And also here it says you must be able to manage the media. This sounds like Machiavelli, but it's not. It's a question. The media go where it's exciting to go. So any little scandal, any little mistake, any little disagreement can become big, important news. So how do you manage the media? Do you have a person on your team who is savvy, clever enough in terms of public relations to actually, do you know the term spin? We say you put a positive spin on things, so whatever happens, you can spin it, you can turn it around to make it look less bad or better. So these teams actually did have training in media relations when they were in the UK. Doesn't always work, but it's helpful. Okay, I think our time is just about over. We started at 1:15, and it's coming to 1:15. Can I just point out a few things that we haven't spoken about so far? Under Exam Center on page 1, head of center and key personnel must understand the principles and the process and the problems of testing and be familiar with the industry guidelines now. Back in 1993, there weren't many guidelines, but now with ALTE, EALTA, and other organizations, there are guidelines. But how do you make sure? This says the head of the center. It doesn't say the politicians. You will never get the politicians to understand. They come and they go. But the head of the center, if you have such a thing as a center, is often a political appointment. And well, I shouldn't say often, it's sometimes a political appointment. And how do you make sure that that person or that little coterie of people understand? Okay, again, I don't know the answer in your situation. Page 2, capacity building. As Christina said, teamwork is important. You need strong core teams representing all the sectors geographically. I would say in terms of communities as well. One slight problem in the countries that I've told you about, which were countries in the former Soviet Union, all of the countries had Russian minorities, but big minorities. Maybe 30% of the population was Russian-speaking, 40%. But generally on the teams, those people were not represented. So it's geographical spread, community spread, and so on. Types of knowledge needed. You need the technical knowledge, which develops as the years go by. You have to start somewhere, and then you learn. And luckily, nowadays, there are so many training opportunities. This is a training opportunity. ALTE, EALTA, they have workshops. So you can find training in technical knowledge. But if you look at the bottom of the page, the other types of skills that are needed: leadership, strategic thinking, lobbying. Lobbying is when you talk to the politicians and try to convince them that what you're doing is okay. Being practical, critical thinking, communication, negotiation, finances, if you handle your own budget, entrepreneurial skills, research skills. Research always gets left out. Research is always seen as an add-on, something we'll do someday if we have time. And it often doesn't get done. So the examination stagnates. It doesn't change. You don't learn. Page 3, we've talked about public relations. We've talked about consensus. Let's just take a look at page 4. Yeah. Research, again, and feeding the results and the recommendations back into the system. So you examine your results, you do your reports, you write your reports in a way that is appropriate for your different audiences. And the connection with publishers. Is this an issue in Spain, that the publishers have a lot of power? Some of you are saying no. In quite a few countries, it's actually the publishers who create washback. If the publishers understand your specifications And if they understand your philosophy, they can do a lot to promote what your exam is trying to achieve. If they don't, then it's disastrous. And I've worked in countries where the publishers look at an exam and they choose certain bits of the exam and they publish preparation materials about those bits of the exam. And then you go into classrooms and you find that teachers are practicing those things because they have the materials, and other bits don't get practiced. So publishers are very important. The final thing, but I think I am preaching to the converted here, is that your team members and your associates need to be able to keep updated by attending professional meetings and contributing to professional meetings so they get feedback and they get new ideas. Okay, so what you've got is factors affecting the long-term impact of an examination. As Neos mentioned, there are 4 columns here that say, what's it like in your context? So it might be an interesting exercise to say, okay, excellent, we do that very well, or we do that okay, or it's problematic, or NA means not applicable. So it might not be relevant to your situation, but it might be an interesting exercise on the train or the plane when you're going home tonight to fill in the form and see what you come up with. So these are things to think about. Unfortunately, there are no answers to any of these questions. That's up to you in your own context, of course. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Vale. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, me acerco yo con el micrófono y podéis hacérsela en español. Si es inglés mejor, si no, yo puedo ayudaros también con la traducción. ¿Vale? ¿Alguna?
Sí, hola. Una pequeña curiosidad. 11 años después, en 2017, ¿cómo están los equipos? Si se ha hecho un seguimiento.
This is a very interesting question. A colleague of mine went to one of these countries last week for another project. But because this colleague had been associated with the original team, he talked to some of the original team members. Some of them are still there. And my colleague said that from what he can see, that actually there has been positive impact in the very long term, because some things are taken for granted now in the best possible way. So some things like, if you believe, not everybody believes in central marking. Okay, so I don't want to say that's the best or only way. But if you believe in a central marking system, no one questions that now. People believe it's a good way to do things. People believe specifications should be written. And there are certain ideas which did live on. So in the very long term, you never know what impact you might have. And even if you despair sometimes and feel very low, it could be that you've had more influence and more positive influence than you think. The problem is, how do you document this? Okay, so it's not just a subjective opinion. My colleague talked to someone and they said blah, blah, blah. It's not anecdotal, but you actually have some proof, you have some evidence, you have some research data so that your claims are credible. But I'm looking forward, when I get home next week, I'm looking forward to finding out more. And it would be lovely to visit those countries again, 10 years, 11 years later. But that's my personal feeling. Anything else?
¿Alguna otra pregunta por aquí? ¿No? ¿Nos animáis?
Okay.
Vale, espera.
You talked about public relations and you talked about stakeholders. The one group that I don't really see on here are students. And linking the two together and talking about how you manage the media, I think students are gradually getting more power in inverted commas through social media in particular. So there's the influence of student perceptions maybe of different exams from such, really basic things like, oh, this is easier than the one that we had before, or from a different awarding body. I think that's something, for maybe a little bit more debate or consideration as we move forward, possibly.
Yes, yeah. You're in an amazing position now because there's so much more available now than there was. So managing the media, I used the word savvy before. Savvy is an English term which comes from savoir-faire, to savoir, to know how to do it. Okay, and if you've got somebody who's good on social media, who can detect what's going on, what's understood, what's not understood, and can manage that as well, great. And not only social media, but lots of other technology as well. Yeah, so each team has its own challenges in its own context, in its own time. One more minute.
Tengo la impresión de que a lo mejor voy a hablar de lo que llamamos en inglés the elephant in the room, que nadie ha hablado todavía de él. Que creo que los equipos de diseñadores de exámenes no tienen condiciones muy buenas para desarrollar su trabajo, que según qué comunidad puede ser mejor o peor. Y además que hay una tendencia a que los departamentos tampoco quieran participar. Que los compañeros, our colleagues in the departments, don't want to participate because the reward is kind of zero, because it's the washback often is kind of from your colleagues in your department. That exam was really hard, or you could do this or you could do that, and everything seems a bit negative, and that you spend so much time on this and it's seldom recognized. So you'll forgive me if I have talked about the elephant in the room, but I had noticed that nobody had brought this up, and I think it's a fundamental problem that we really need to address. Well, somebody, somewhere needs to address. Okay, thank you.
I agree, and I didn't mean to ignore the problem. When I said that the team in the particular country that was my example resigned in 2001, they were tired, they were exhausted, they were fed up. And the same has happened in many countries. So it's recognized. One interesting thing, one of the team members who was from a teacher training institution, and her job was to try to train new teachers to be interested in testing. Okay, so she trained incipient testers. She found that generally her students were so interested in the subject. The principles of assessment are very interesting. And thinking about the nature of language, it's so interesting. But then when the young trainees learned about the reality of working in the centers and the low pay, the long hours, the abuse, etc., that one of the reasons it was hard to find a replacement team is because those young people were they were frightened. Yeah, so they were very interested and wanted to help, but they're very realistic as well. And if you want to be really graphic about it, marriages have been destroyed by language testing.
Vale.
By people working too hard and not paying enough attention to their families. So it's tough. You have to be committed, or you have to be working in a system that protects you.
Okay. So
thank you.
Thank you very much, Dianne. Vamos a dejarlo aquí. Es la pausa de café ahora hasta las 11, donde volveremos a encontrarnos en esta misma aula. Está justo en el lado opuesto del edificio, la cafetería. Vale, y ya está todo preparado. Gracias. Vale.